Before 1941, the United States watched the world burn from a distance. Europe was at war, Asia was in flames, and yet America remained a distant power, strong but deliberately uninvolved. That illusion collapsed on a quiet Sunday morning. December 7th was not just an attack, it was a historical rupture. A day that will live in infamy, declared Franklin D. Roosevelt, marking the moment when distance stopped offering protection. From that instant, the global balance of power shifted irreversibly. The American entry into the war was not cautious or symbolic. It unleashed forces that would redefine how wars were fought and how they were won. This was not just about joining the conflict, but about changing its direction entirely. How did the United States go from determined neutrality to total war? Why did a country so reluctant to fight become the decisive force of the conflict? To answer that, we need to go back and understand why America resisted entering the war in the first place. The American reluctance to enter World War II did not emerge suddenly in the late 1930s. It was rooted deeply in the trauma of World War I. More than 100,000 Americans had been killed and hundreds of thousands wounded in a conflict many later believed had solved little. President Woodrow Wilson's vision of a new international order centered on collective security and the League of Nations, when the United States itself refused to join the institution it had helped design. For many Americans, this failure confirmed a bitter lesson. Involvement in European wars brought enormous sacrifice with limited return. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, this disillusionment hardened into political doctrine. The priority became domestic stability, not global leadership. The Great Depression reinforced this inward focus as unemployment, poverty, and economic collapse demanded attention at home. Congress translated public sentiment into law through a series of neutrality acts, designed explicitly to prevent the circumstances that had drawn the United States into World War I. These laws restricted arms sales, loans, and travel involving nations at war. By the late 1930s, isolationism was not apathy. It was a deliberate strategy to avoid repeating what many Americans viewed as a historic mistake. As war spread across Europe and Asia, the United States became locked in one of the most intense public debates in its history. On one side stood the isolationists, who argued that World War II was fundamentally a foreign struggle. They believed the nation's safety depended on strong defenses at home and strict neutrality abroad. The America First Committee emerged as the most influential isolationist organization, using radio broadcasts, newspapers, and mass rallies to shape public opinion. Its most prominent voice, Aviator Charles Lindbergh, insisted that America should defend the Western Hemisphere but avoid fighting everybody in the world who prefers some other system of life to ours. Opposing them were the interventionists, who warned that American security could not survive a world dominated by Nazi Germany. They argued that if Britain fell, the United States would face an isolated future in a hostile global order. President Franklin D. Roosevelt echoed this concern, cautioning that neutrality in such a world would be like living at the point of a gun. Public opinion slowly shifted as events worsened abroad. Polls showed growing support for aiding Britain, even if it risked war. The debate was no longer abstracted, was becoming existential. By 1940, global events made American indecision increasingly untenable. Nazi Germany overran much of Europe, conquering France and leaving Britain standing alone. German bombers pounded British cities, while war expanded across Asia under Japanese aggression. Each month brought new evidence that distance no longer guaranteed safety. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, once seen as protective barriers, felt suddenly narrower. The question facing the United States was no longer whether the war would affect it but when and how. The tension built relentlessly toward a breaking point that isolationism could no longer contain. If this story helped you understand why America hesitated and why that hesitation mattered, take a moment to support the channel. Leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the moments when history truly turns. Because the debate is over, the distance is gone, and American power is about to be tested on a scale the world has never seen. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the war that had consumed Europe and Asia finally reached American soil. Japanese aircraft launched a surprise attack against the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, targeting battleships, airfields, and military infrastructure. In just 2 hours, the scale of destruction was staggering. 18 American warships were sunk or damaged, 164 aircraft were destroyed, and more than 2,400 servicemen and civilians were killed. The attack was not a warning shot, it was a calculated blow designed to cripple American naval power in the Pacific. For the United States, the psychological impact was as devastating as the material losses. The oceans that had long symbolized safety and distance suddenly felt meaningless. The war had not crept closer. It had arrived without invitation. The following day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, declaring, "No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory." Congress responded with near unanimity, declaring war on Japan with only a single dissenting vote. Within days, the conflict escalated further. Germany and Italy, bound by alliance to Japan, declared war on the United States. What had been a regional war in the Pacific and a continental war in Europe instantly became a truly global conflict. Pearl Harbor marked the definitive end of American isolationism. From that moment forward, the United States was no longer choosing whether to engage. It was committed up to the neck, as Winston Churchill would later write, to a war that would demand everything the nation could produce, train, and endure. The war had come to America's doorstep, and retreat was no longer possible. Across the Atlantic, news of Pearl Harbor was received not with shock, but with a profound sense of relief. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill learned of the attack while spending the weekend at Chequers and immediately confirmed the news with President Roosevelt by transatlantic telephone. In his memoirs, Churchill described the moment with striking clarity. The entry of the United States into the war was, in his words, the greatest joy. After years of standing nearly alone, after the fall of France and relentless German bombing Britain finally knew the balance had shifted. Churchill did not celebrate because the war was suddenly easy. He understood the cost ahead would be immense, with terrible forfeits still to come. But, strategically, the conclusion was clear. With the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and now the United States bound together, the Allies possessed overwhelming potential strength. Churchill believed their combined power was twice, or even thrice, the force of their antagonists. The question was no longer whether the Axis could be defeated, but how long it would take. The American entry carried enormous psychological weight. For Britain, it transformed the war from a desperate struggle for survival into a long-term campaign that could be won through sustained pressure. For the Axis powers, it meant facing an enemy with unmatched industrial capacity and human reserves. From this point forward, Allied strategy could shift from containment to eventual counteroffensive. The war had not ended, but its trajectory had changed irreversibly. The demonstration of American power did not remain abstract for long. In January 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, the first American ground troops arrived in the British Isles. Soldiers of the U.S. Army's 34th Infantry Division, the Red Bull Division, landed in Belfast, Northern Ireland on January 26th, after crossing an Atlantic still patrolled by German U. Their convoy had sailed from Brooklyn earlier that month, carrying more than 4,000 combat soldiers through waters where Allied shipping losses were a constant threat. The arrival was deeply symbolic. For over 2 years, Britain had faced Nazi Germany largely on its own. Now, foreign troop, well-fed and visibly confident, were marching through British streets. Crowds gathered to watch, bands played, and locals reacted with a mixture of relief, curiosity, and cautious optimism. One American soldier, Private Milburn Henke of Minnesota, was reported as the first to step onto British soil, captured smiling and waving to the Belfast crowd. Beyond the ceremony, the numbers told a larger story. Approximately 300,000 American soldiers would deploy to Northern Ireland alone, with 1.5 million eventually stationed in Great Britain or passing through on their way to North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany. These troops were not yet fighting major battles in Europe, but their presence signaled something crucial. The United States was preparing not just to participate, but to lead. Britain was becoming a staging ground for liberation, and the Atlantic a highway of men and material flowing east. Behind the soldiers crossing oceans stood an industrial mobilization unlike anything in history. After Pearl Harbor, the United States rapidly converted its civilian economy into a war machine. Factories were retooled, new plants were built, and government spending surged. President Roosevelt described this transformation with a defining phrase: the United States would become the arsenal of democracy. The scale was unprecedented. By 1941, America's military had already grown to nearly 2.2 million personnel, and millions more would follow through voluntary enlistment and the draft. At home, production exploded. Annual economic output more than doubled between 1940 and 1945. Aircraft factories produced planes at rates that stunned even military planners, while shipyards, tank plants, and munitions factories worked around the clock. Crucially, American industry produced not only for its own forces, but also for its allies, supplying Britain and the Soviet Union with vital equipment. This industrial surge was itself a weapon. It meant that losses could be replaced, campaigns sustained, and long wars endured. The Axis powers fought with limits. The United States fought with momentum. By turning economic capacity into strategic power, America ensured that its entry into the war would not be symbolic or temporary. It would be decisive, measured not just in battles won, but in the sheer ability to outproduce and outlast its enemies. The entry of the United States into World War II marked far more than the addition of another nation to an already global conflict. It signaled the definitive end of American isolationism and the beginning of a new role that would define the remainder of the 20th century. Before 1941, the United States had been a powerful observer, cautiously engaged, but unwilling to commit fully. After Pearl Harbor, that posture vanished. America did not merely join the war, it reshaped it through scale, endurance, and strategic depth. The arrival of American forces in Britain transformed the Allied position. What had been a nation fighting for survival became the launching platform for an eventual counteroffensive. American soldiers crossing the Atlantic were not just reinforcements, they were a visible promise that time, resources, and momentum had shifted. Britain no longer stood alone, and the Axis powers now faced an enemy capable of sustaining a war of attrition on a level they could not match. The transatlantic alliance, forged in these early months, laid the groundwork for every major Allied operation that followed. Equally decisive was the industrial transformation unfolding behind the front lines. The arsenal of democracy turned factories into weapons and logistics into strategy. American power was expressed not only in battleships and divisions, but in the ability to replace losses, support allies, and fight simultaneously across continents. This capacity altered the very nature of the war. Victory became a question of coordination and time rather than survival alone. As Winston Churchill recognized, once the United States committed fully, the outcome was no longer in doubt, only its cost and duration remained uncertain. By the end of the war, the consequences of 1941 were unmistakable. The United States emerged not as a temporary participant, but as a permanent global power. Its partnership with the United Kingdom evolved into a lasting strategic relationship, and its willingness to project power beyond its borders became a defining feature of the post-war world. The moment American power entered World War II for the first time was not simply a turning point in the conflict. It was the birth of a new international order, one in which the United States would no longer watch history unfold, but shape it.